Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. Now I'm Philip Ingram. I present Times Radio Frontline, but I also comment on all matters geopolitical, defence, security, cyber and anything else that people ask me to. And I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and NATO planner. So that's the perspectives I'm coming from. But I'm going to recommend some videos for you to watch this week, and I'm going to show you some clips on it. However, I would suggest you go back and watch all of them, because the interviews that we've done, as we do every week, are phenomenal, and will keep you informed as to what is happening. By way of start, we've got an unusual video from the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, where he's speaking in English, and he's talking about security guarantees for Ukraine. Let's have a look here.
President Putin and President Trump in Anchorage discussed the security guarantees, and President Putin recalled that in April 2022 in Istanbul, during negotiations initiated by the Ukrainian side, very soon after we started our special military operation, during those negotiations in April in 2022, Ukrainian delegation presented a draft principles to reach a treaty, to reach agreement on ending the war. Those principles were initialed by both delegations. As regards the security guarantees for Ukraine, those principles proposed by Ukrainian delegation, I underline this once again, they provided for creation of a group of guarantors. This group containing of permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, US, China, UK, and France. Plus, they mentioned Germany, Turkey, and any other country which would be interested to join this group of guarantors. And guarantors would be guaranteeing the security of Ukraine, which must be neutral, which must be non-aligned with any military bloc, and which must be non-nuclear.
Now, Lavrov talks of draft principles for security guarantees and talks of nations that are contributing, but he puts some very firm lines in the sand. He wants them to be non-aligned. He wants the contributing countries not to be part of any security alliances. And effectively what he's doing is he's trying to suggest that it's any country apart from a country that Russia would approve of coming in and providing Ukraine security guarantees, and that doesn't tie in with any security guarantees. Of course, we have to remember that Russia was a signatory to the Budapest agreement, which gave Ukraine security guarantees whenever they gave up the old Soviet nuclear weapons that they had. And therefore, from a Russian perspective, any security guarantees aren't worth the paper that they're written on. So we're nowhere near that happening at the moment, but it's Lavrov trying to influence the English-speaking population by coming across as the very articulate, wily old diplomat that he is. And then that ties in with President Donald Trump, and I want you to just have a listen to what he has to say here.
Go ahead.
On the way to Alaska, you had mentioned that there would be severe consequences if Vladimir Putin did not agree to a ceasefire.
Yeah.
After that summit that was rolled back, given the negotiations, is he back on the clock now?
I want to see that deal end. It's very, very serious what I have in mind if I have to do it, but I want to see it end. I think that in many ways he's there. Sometimes he'll be there and Zelensky won't be there. You know, it's like, who do we have today? I got to get them both at the same time. But I want to have it end. We have economic sanctions. I'm talking about economic, because we're not going to get into a world war. No, I'd like it to stop. I want to get it to stop. And it will not be a world war, but it will be an economic war. And an economic war is going to be bad. And it's going to be bad for Russia, and I don't want that. Now, I have to also see, because not everybody, you know, Zelensky's not exactly innocent either, okay? You know, it takes two people to tango, and I say it all the time. You got to get them together. I get along with Zelensky now, but we have a much different relationship, because now we're not paying any money to Ukraine. You know, stop that. We're paying money to ourselves. What's happening is NATO is buying all of the equipment and paying in full. But even with that, forget about that. I want to get it stopped because it's a lot of lives that are being lost. Thousands of young people, mostly young people, are dying every single week. If I can save that by doing sanctions or by just being me, or by using a very strong tariff system that's very costly to Russia or Ukraine or whoever we have, But I stopped 7 wars, and 3 of those wars were going on for more than 30 years. But the one that I thought would be the easiest is turning out to be the hardest. That's President Putin and President Zelensky, but I think I'll get it done.
Why do you
Can
think
you
that
stop
is? Why is it harder
this,
than you
officer?
thought?
I have a question for Steve Witkoff, if I may.
Yeah.
This past weekend, Sergei Lavrov was saying that Putin will not sign a peace deal with Zelensky because Russia views him as illegitimate. I'm just wondering if the Russians have been relaying this to your team, if they view Zelensky, as a leader worth signing a peace deal with, if they will.
Doesn't matter what they say. Steve can answer, but I can answer too. Doesn't matter what they say. Everybody's posturing. It's all okay. Everybody's posturing. Steve, do you have a different answer?
I agree with you, sir.
And this is Donald Trump talking of it takes 2 to tango. Well, hey, come on. That's a soundbite that we all know of. But I think the interesting thing I want to emphasize here is he says he's stopped 7 wars. Well, that's him going out to saying, please give me the Nobel Peace Prize. But when he's talking about the war in Ukraine and his response to that, he emphasizes 2 or 3 times that this is not going to turn into World War III. It is going to be an economic war if America has to get involved. And this is when he's questioning and been questioned on the application of the tariffs and the secondary tariffs that he's brought out. But he does emphasize that this is going to be, he's considering an economic war 2 or 3 times. And then very quickly turned around and says that he's not just focusing this on Vladimir Putin in Moscow, but he also says that Zelensky has got things to answer for. So he's trying to make himself sound balanced. Whether he is actually being balanced or where he's coming from, like anything, Donald Trump is only as good as what he said for the length of time he said it, and can change his mind 10 or 15 minutes later. But those are 2 good introductions to the fantastic interviews that I want to point you to this week. And the first one I want to point is me having a chat with Bill Browder. Now, Bill, if ever there was someone who understood the Russian psyche, the Russian oligarch psyche, Vladimir Putin's psyche, it's Bill. And in this clip, he's trying to put into perspective some of the things that are going on. Have a look here.
Ukraine has just put the finishing touches on a new long-range missile called the Flamingo missile.
The Flamingo.
And the Flamingo basically replicates, not perfectly, but replicates a lot of these long-range missiles, the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow missiles that we have been providing from the West, the United States and UK and other countries in limited quantities. And so now the Ukrainians have, in their own capacity, these Flamingo missiles to go 3,000 kilometers into Russia. And as a result, I think you're going to see all sorts of interesting economic targets being hit. And if the West is not going to impose sanctions, then Ukraine will impose sanctions, and good on them for doing it.
Yeah, 3,000 kilometers and 1,125 kilograms of high explosives. That has a very nasty effect on oil refineries and other bits and pieces. But do you think Putin's actually worried? You know him better than most, and his inner team. What will they be saying? What will they be thinking? What will they be trying to do at the moment?
Well, so Putin puts on a brave face. He pretends everything is fine. He doesn't care. His war is going well. He's absolutely panicking back in his bunker about all this stuff, because the only way that he can carry on doing this war is if the Russian people don't turn on him. And it's easy to prevent the people from turning on him if he's got money to slosh around out there. And he's been sloshing it around pretty well, paying soldiers a lot of money, paying the families a lot of money, etc. But if the money dries up, then he's got a problem, because all it takes is one social event and then he loses control. And that's his biggest fear. He doesn't want 1 million people storming Red Square, because he can kill the leader of an opposition party. He can kill Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, but he can't kill 1 million people and stop an uprising. And so from his perspective, this is deeply worrying. They have got to figure out a way to stop it. At the moment, they have no way of stopping it. And this is a very good tactic, in the same way as when the Ukrainians did this amazing military operation of taking out 1/3 of the long-range bombers in Russia with drones. And so, I mean, the Ukrainians are extremely resourceful when it comes to fighting with smaller resources, and thankfully, the Ukrainians are still well supported by the European Union, the UK, Canada, Norway, and many other countries. And so, the Ukrainians, are a formidable force, and perhaps at this point, the most capable fighting force in Europe.
Oh, definitely the most capable and the most experienced. And Operation Spider's Web, that drone attack against the strategic bombers, was a masterstroke. And Zelensky clearly knew that he had not just the right cards in his pocket, but he had a full house, as Donald Trump was accusing him of not having any cards. But you mentioned the potential impact on the Russian economy and the Russian people. We're getting reports that indicate that Russia's budget deficit is nearing 5 trillion rubles, and non-military sectors of the economy are stagnating. We're even getting reports of some of the military sectors having difficulty in the manufacturing output because they're not getting paid. Is this getting close to a collapse in the Russian economy? Or do you think this is just a sort of slow, longer-term decline? And how long do you think it is before Putin will get exceptionally worried, or the people will start to rise up?
Well, I don't think we're anywhere near a collapse of the Russian economy, specifically because in addition to the oil refining, which they do, they also export a lot of oil. And the buyers of that exported oil pay, the China, India, Turkey, they pay hundreds of billions of dollars a year to Russia, and that's a lot of money. And so I don't think there's we're even close to a collapse of the Russian economy. But if we were to find some way of preventing them from selling their crude oil, then we would be close to a collapse of the Russian economy. And that could have happened in the days after the Anchorage summit if Trump had not basically capitulated.
But again, the Russians are reportedly dipping into the National Wealth Fund to cover the growing deficit. There must be something at some stage which will sort of, if it doesn't trigger the people, those at the next layer down in the oligarch structure that are supporting Putin will say enough is enough. We're losing too much money here. We need to get back on some form of even keel and get our lifestyles back together again. Are there any indications of that?
No, none whatsoever. And one should have seen that 3.5 years ago. If that was at all a political force, these oligarchs, of course, were the ones that are loving their luxury and their yachts in the south of France and Sardinia and all this kind of stuff. They were immediately banned from those places. And if they were any kind of political force, we would have seen this long time ago. But the fact of the matter is that they're entirely dependent on Putin to be alive, to be wealthy, and to be out of jail. At any point, Putin could end their lives or end their freedom or end their wealth with one stroke of the pen. And so these people, and I've seen that with my own eyes, I've seen how these Russian oligarchs behave. They sort of thump their chest like the most alpha males on steroids until the moment that Putin walks into the room, and then they behave like these subservient little eunuchs. And that is the basis for which Putin has nothing to worry about when it comes to oligarchs. And I think he has more to worry about when it comes to his own people, is if they ever decide they're angry. And that's one of those things that's impossible to predict. It's it's easy for Putin to target individuals. It's not easy for him to suppress an angry nation. And I would argue that part of the reason that he went into Ukraine in the first place was that he's been a dictator for so long, and people's lives have not improved for so long, that he was worried about people being angry with him. And so he pulled out the Machiavelli playbook and said, how do we prevent, as a dictator, how do I prevent my people from rising up against me? And the answer is to find a foreign enemy and to start a war. And the war with Ukraine is kind of not even a natural war. It's not as if they're natural enemies. I mean, it's more likely, if you're to look at geopolitics and the world, China would be a more natural enemy to Russia than Ukraine. But Putin picked Ukraine because they were easy to fight with and he thought were easy to fight with. It turned out not to be the case.
Now, Bill is talking about Putin putting a brave face on Ukraine's renewed attacks against Russian oil infrastructure and elsewhere. And in particular, this new Flamingo missile, cruise missile that the Ukrainians have developed, a range of 3,000 kilometers, a warhead of just over 1,100 kilograms. And that is something that the Ukrainians have shown that they are using to attack Russian infrastructure. And from a psychological perspective, the Ukrainians put out some pictures from their factory of the Flamingo missiles, and on them chalked to the side of two of the missiles with the numbers 178 and 179, suggesting that there's 178 and 179 missiles already produced and are ready to fire. That is part of trying to influence Vladimir Putin. Bill understands Putin, and when I questioned him and asked what impact this would be having, he said, of course, on the surface, you see this serene individual swimming along like a duck is swimming along, but underneath it, he's panicking. And it's the attacks on infrastructure that he says will have Putin worried about not his position with regard to those that are in his immediate inner circle potentially turning on him, because he says he's got control over them, but it's the people and the way that this is bringing a message to the Russian people. And he says that the one thing that Vladimir Putin fears most is 1 million Russians storming Red Square and putting pressure on him, because he can't deal with that. And therefore, any pressure that there is on the Russian economy that will influence the Russian people, and we're seeing that already with the supply of fuel outside Moscow, but it will come into Moscow at some stage if Ukrainian attacks continue to be success. And it's that pressure that's important. But Bill then emphasises that the Russian economy is not near collapse at the moment. They've still got the ability to ride out what's going on, because they're still selling their crude oil around the world. He again re-emphasised that there's no indications of dissent amongst the oligarchs. Well worth watching this clip, but go back and watch the whole interview, because Bill, what he says is fascinating. Next interview is with Hamish de Bretton Gordon, a good friend, talking to my friend and colleague and our producer, Louis Sykes. And Hamish is talking about how the Russians are operating in a tactical level, and the fact that they're using motorbike troops and they're using chemical weapons on the front line. But it's not really having a significant impact. Yes, they take a few tens of meters or a few hundred meters or a few buildings or maybe a village, but they can't hold the ground and get pushed back. And it's this constant toing and froing that it means that there's no real advantage happening. The Ukrainians have been able to maneuver and plug the holes that the Russians are finding. Because if we look at the size of the front line, it's 650 kilometres long. That, in UK terms, is from Aberdeen to London. And there's no way can you cover that completely with the numbers of troops that are there. But these small bands of determined Russians on suicide missions to get through just aren't working. And Hamish, quite rightly, evidences that the Russians don't really have a grand plan or a manoeuvrist approach to this conflict. And that tactical innovation is stifled because commanders at the lowest levels are not allowed to make decisions. They have to refer it right up to the highest levels, and he even goes on to say, including up to Moscow at times, to get authorization. And that's a hierarchy of command. But again, Hamish rightly emphasizes that this is nothing new. This is how the Russians operated during the Second World War. It's how we expected the Russians to operate during the Cold War, if that had ever turned into a hot war. So we shouldn't be surprised to see them operating this way. There is innovation on the front line and the use of motorbike troops and the use of drones and all the rest of it. And the Russians are trying to change their tactics, but the basic things that they're not changing are sending human beings into a meat grinder to sacrifice themselves because that's the one commodity that Putin has got access to huge numbers of and doesn't mind how many he loses.
The Russians have made a lot about this, but we're talking about fairly small, isolated operations. Russia is talking about its great motorbike troops, as they call them, where 100 blokes on motorbikes steam through minefields that don't get blown up because the motorbikes aren't heavy enough, and break through the lines. But 99% of those motorbikes and people on them are either killed or captured, and they might hold a bit of ground for a few hours, but that doesn't happen. We've talked before of the massive use of chemical weapons, chlorpyrifos. Again, same deal. Use a lot of that, gain a bit of space, but then going back again. And I think all the observers in the US and around the place who are looking at this closely would say, the front lines have changed very, very little in the last 18 months. There are a few pushes here and there, but around Petrovsk, where so much fighting has gone on, the Russians might own one street today, but they'll lose it tomorrow. So I don't think any of the incursions by the Russians will have a strategic or even a significant local impact. But it is key that the Ukrainians maintain the ability to move forces around and plug any gaps, which they seem to be able to do. And it's really tough, but they're just about managing it. But I don't expect to see any big breakthroughs. And I agree with the UK MOD assessment that the Russians, if they take the whole of the Donbass, which they want, is going to take them a heck of a long time, and they're going to lose a lot of people doing it.
And elsewhere in eastern Ukraine, the Russians continue to advance into Dnipropetrovsk region, which is not a region they lay claim to, or one they've voiced any interest in annexing, as they have attempted to do with other regions. The town of Zaporizhzhia was taken by Russia just today, according to the Russian military, of course. I mean, is any land taken a victory? Is there a strategy here for Ukraine of focus on certain areas that might be more strategically important, or they don't think they're going to get back?
Well, that might be the case. That's on the assumption that the Russian high command have a grand strategic plan, which is what we would call, the maneuverist approach, the sort of thinking back to philosophers like Sun Tzu and others, and Clausewitz. But there has been no evidence of this. Most of the Russian attacks have been very, very blunt, very static, very sort of straight up the middle, no maneuver involved, just pouring more and more troops into what's being called the meat grinder, which is pretty much what happened, how the Russians fought in the Second World War. I mean, the Russians lost 26 million people in the Second World War. Britain lost 245,000. In comparison, and Britain, we would like to think we were much more maneuverous the way we fought in North Africa, the way we fought in Normandy and across the Low Countries. So it's very easy to sort of navel gaze at these things and perhaps come up with some brilliant plan the Russians are doing, but that would be a surprise. I think they might take the odd opportunity, but I suppose the final bit on this, it's the way that Russia command and control operations, particularly within the army. Nobody is allowed to make any important decision at a low level. Everything has to be passed back up the chain of command. What that means is that innovation is stifled. The ability to take an opportunity, if it suddenly appears, you can't do it. And basically, people are terrified of their superiors. And ultimately, of course, Putin gets involved in what we'd call very low-level tactical decisions, which, if you imagine how long it takes from a platoon or a company of, say, 100 men fighting near Petrovsk to get a decision back from the Kremlin, hundreds of miles away, we're talking days here. And in my experience on the battlefield, opportunities are usually fleeting. And in an hour's time, they might have gone. In a couple of days' time, their history. So, I think the Russians are just doing what they've always done. Just keep, using manpower and using equipment, and not worrying about casualties, collateral damage. I mean, the final bit, we understand the Russians have lost nearly 6,000 tanks in this war, which, when you think the British Army has just over 100 tanks, slightly puts it into perspective.
Our final video today is with Ben Hodges and General Ben talking to my friend and colleague Kate Gerbeau. He's talking about the size of Russia, and this is what I want to emphasize in his interview, and how that size of Russia gives Ukraine a degree of freedom of action across Russia when it comes to attacking the critical infrastructure. But I think the one point I want to bring out of Ben's interview here and that size analogy is the Russians actually are not using a maneuverist approach in their defenses against the Ukrainian attacks, because if you look at the launch sites for the Ukrainian Flamingo missiles, you look at the Russian-Ukrainian border, the Ukrainians can only launch from a certain number of areas. The missiles can only cross the border in a certain number of places. And therefore the flight paths to get to the critical infrastructure, given the range, can be worked out, and you can work out with a degree of probability what the most likely flight paths would be, and then redeploy your air defence capability into those flight paths to try and deal with the threat. What's quite clear is the Russians are not doing that, and that either shows that they don't have the ability to plan at those sorts of levels and give that level of flexibility, or they don't have the capability to interdict the Ukrainian drones that are flying and other UAVs that are flying across Russian territory. And that is suggesting that their military capability is nowhere near as strong as people hope.
Russia, traditionally, its strength was its vastness. The fact that, invading nations or armies could come in, but they would just eventually be swallowed up by the vastness of Russia. That now seems to be a strategic weakness or vulnerability because they cannot possibly protect all of their infrastructure. For example, there's not enough air defense in the world to be able to do that. And so the ability now that Ukraine has developed to reach 1,000 kilometers, for example, into places where they can hit oil infrastructure is significant. The point that you're making is correct. It's the quantity. I mean, if you can only do this as like once a week, you hit one thing, that gets repaired. And of course, the Russians will eventually come up with ways to counter this capability. So getting the quantity as fast as possible to achieve the strategic effect, but also continuing to work on parallel things that would happen or that would help achieve the effect is a part of this as well. And this is where I think nations like UK, Germany, and Norway can contribute directly to that sort of acceleration.
Ukraine appears to, until now, have had a sporadic but quite successful air campaign against Russia in Russia itself. Do you think that, you mentioned it earlier, that the Trump administration has withheld the use of ATACMS missiles when it reportedly barred these cross-border attacks to lure Putin into talks. Having said that, Ukraine is managing and hailing the new FP5 Flamingo cruise missile, which it says it's ready to produce en masse by perhaps the autumn. Can you just set this into context for us and tell us about the importance of this missile?
Well, the Ukrainians understand that Russia's ability to continue the war is tied directly to their ability to export oil and gas to China, India, Turkey, and other customers. And so part of this, of course, in UK, by the way, is sanctioned, I think, well over 100 of these Shadow Fleet vessels. So that's part of the effort to disrupt Russia's ability to export oil and gas. But Ukraine going after the refineries is an amazing improvement in their capability. I read earlier this morning or yesterday that Russia's capacity has been reduced by 17%. That's enormous. I mean, imagine any industry in UK that lost almost a fifth of its capability, what the impact would be. It's enormous. So Ukraine Unfortunately, they're doing it with weapons that they produce that cannot be stopped or disrupted by the U.S. or anybody else. ATACMS, of course, is a terrific weapon for precision against tactical targets, headquarters, logistics, and I think it's shameful that the administration is blocking that, and that they may also be blocking use of Storm Shadow because there's an American aspect to this. I think these are shameful policies by us, so the Ukrainians are not going to sit around and wait.
Those are the 3 interviews this week. I would point you to. Please go and watch all of them, but go and watch all of our videos this week because they're all good. If you want to be kept up to speed with what's going on, please sign up for Times Radio Frontline membership, because that'll give you exclusive access to our videos earlier than anyone else. It'll allow you to put your questions and comments that we can answer in our question and answer session, and we'll give you access to further exclusive content. And of course, if you want to get us on your favourite podcast channel, we're now available by just going to your podcast channel and searching for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.